Hey everyone, we're going to do a longer sewing video. I posted a short version of this in the Facebook group and then realized I recorded it in real time, so maybe it would be helpful to just do some chatting over the top of what we're seeing. So I'm using a permanent marker to trace the sewing line of the pattern onto my flannel fabric. I use a hidden layer of flannel for ease in my workflow. So if you're not using a hidden layer, then you'd be drawing this line on the back of your fabric, like the decorative fabric, and sometimes that fabric is dark and you can't see the line that you're drawing on there. So then you need to go find a different kind of marking utensil that is white or can show up on dark fabrics, and that can get kind of annoying. Those kinds of markers don't last very long sometimes. I have used white gel pen with some success, but again, it's just easier for me, I think, to just always know this is the Sharpie I use flannel, like I can turn my brain off, so I like that. I also like not having to see the stitching on the top of the pad, so I can go a little faster and not worry about stitching imperfections when sewing the core on because it's hidden inside the pad. So I'm using a rotary cutter. I like the small size. I think this is 28 millimeters. So yeah, I apparently need to get sharper blades. This next fabric is called Zorb, and I got this from Wazoodle. I ordered it online, and this is Zorb Generation 1. I think that's how you say it. So you don't have to pre-wash this. In fact, you shouldn't, because they say it'll fall apart if you wash it without it being sewn into something. I really like this because it's easy to sew with, doesn't need to be pre-washed, and it's just a lot easier than using bamboo fleece or bamboo terry. Bamboo terry is one of my other favorite options for cores. Like, it's amazing, but the amount that you have to pre-wash it to make sure that it's shrunk before you sew it is really tiring. I did it for a long time, but the Zorb is just fantastic. You just receive your fabric, lay it out on the cutting board, and then cut out the shape and stick it on there. So I used just a little bit of basting spray to put the core in the middle of the sewing line before I sew it on, instead of using pins. Several times I've tried to get away from the basting spray because it's kind of expensive, and I just haven't yet because I'm, lazy. But anyway, here's the fabric I'm using, doing some fussy cutting here. I really loved that geode section, and then I put the flannel layer on top of it and just rough cut around. I'm not using any kind of measured seam allowance, because later I will trim off the seam allowance with my pinking shears, so it won't matter. Am I slightly wasteful doing this? Maybe a little bit, but the time that I save is worth it to me, to be wasting a little bit of fabric. So this brown fabric is called Wimpro 9411. It's just a fleece. I don't know if that is specifically available anymore. So I'm attaching the core to the flannel with a straight stitch. I will backstitch at the start and at the end to lock in the stitches. Because the stitching will not be visible on the top of the pad, I just backstitch. But if I were going to have visible stitching, I might leave long tails and not backstitch, and then at the very end pull all of the tails to the back of the fabric and then tie them in a knot so that you wouldn't see any back stitching. That takes a little more time, but it's a nice detail if you're going to have exposed stitching on the top of your pad. Like, I used to do a wavy stitch to attach the core, and I thought that looked really nice on the top of the pad. So yeah, just go slow. If you're using pins, feel free to use as many pins as you need to keep the core in place. And also, another hint is I lift the presser foot constantly. I don't try to do curves by manipulating the fabric and like forcing it through without lifting the presser foot. Something I've learned is that beautiful curves come from a series of straight lines. As you know, that's what the stitches are. They're just little straight lines. So just lift and pivot and set the presser foot down again, and it will look great. Okay, so I'm putting right sides together so the right side. Sometimes I take for granted what is just common knowledge with sewing at this point. So you want to turn in top stitch, which means the intended layers to be on the outside need to be facing in right now. So it needs to look inside out right now. And then you're going to pin around the outline, the sewing line, and then sew on that line, directly on it. I used to provide seam allowance lines on my sewing patterns because that's like the most common way people sew, is using the seam allowance as a guide with the presser foot or some other marking on the sewing machine. But I've realized with these really detailed shapes of cloth pads, being so small, that when I would offset the lines for seam allowance, it would distort the shape of the pad to have the shape get bigger, and then when you sew it smaller again, it doesn't work. So I just, and I also find the process easier to just position the needle above the red sewing line, and it helps me feel more in control of my sewing, to know that I am exactly on the line that I need to be on. So at this point, I just go really slow, especially when there's lots of little details, like on a novelty shape like this. I'm lifting the presser foot with one hand and pivoting the pad with the other hand. At this point, stitching on the sewing line, I'm using a stitch length of about 2.5, and if I'm back stitching, I might make it a little shorter, but I don't know if that's necessary. When I was attaching the core, I used a stitch length of about 3. I think that also looks nicer if your core stitching is exposed on the top of the pad, to make the stitching a little longer, like a 3 or maybe slightly longer than that. Some people ask me what presser foot I'm using, and I'm always hesitant to answer because I think it really depends on the machine that you have and just trying out what options are available on your machine. The machine I had before this was a Singer, and I loved using the walking foot on that machine. It worked really well. But then when I got this machine, which is a Bernina, I put the walking foot on there, and I didn't like it at all. So now I'm never using the walking foot, which I find fascinating because people rave about it being such a necessity, and I would have agreed with them with my previous machine. So I think it just depends. Like, try a variety of feet on your machine and see what works for your process. Like, I switched the foot from like what I use to sew the core and then what I use to sew like top stitching. I use 2 different feet because I just like to align the pad when I'm top stitching to a different foot. So it just comes through experimentation for me. I did not learn to sew real clothing. I basically know how to sew cloth diapers and cloth pads, and I've done a few other things, like I've made some bags. I have serged a few clothing items like leggings for my kids, but that's basically it. I don't know like the proper sewing terms for a lot of things. It's all been through experimentation, and that would be my advice to you if you're new to sewing. Just get in the mindset of playing. This doesn't have to be perfect. There is no goal to achieve necessarily. There's no right or wrong in the end. If you're having fun, that is the best way to do it, because you will improve so fast if you're having fun. And I get a little hard on myself about things looking really nice at the end. I'm a little bit of a perfectionist, and I think there are a lot of you also like that. So just figure out how to have fun so that you'll keep going, and improvement will be a byproduct that is inevitable. So, yeah. Okay, the next thing to talk about is the turning hole. I like to leave it on a long, straight edge if possible, so I'm going to put it on the side of this heart shape. And I like to leave it as big as possible without being like too big. I know that's very vague, but you get the feel for it after a little while, because I don't like to be stressing out the seams trying to turn the pad out and possibly ripping stitches or ripping holes in the fabric. Okay, so to trim the seam allowance off, this is really important to avoid puckering and to make the pad look really nice. You need to snip into these inner corners, pretty close to the sewing line, but not so close that you're going to have fabric fraying at the seam. Again, it's going to take a little experimentation to figure out exactly where to go, but these are the areas that you need to trim off to have the pad looking really neat when you turn it right side out. So snip into those inner corners with some sharp scissors, and then I'm going to trim off the seam allowance with pinking shears. Now, pinking shears are kind of a difficult thing to get that work well. I have tried several brands that you get locally, like at Joann's, and they all kind of suck. The pinking shears that I'm using here happen to be very cheap from Amazon. I think they were like $9 or $10. I need to go hunt down the link, but I'll put it in the description once I find it. They're the best. They are 7mm, I think, because there were different options, like a smaller tooth option. This is a bigger tooth than what you find in stores, I think. It seems to work just fine, and it goes a little faster, easier to cut with, I think. So here I'm just going to snip into that with my little scissors, and then you can see it releases the tension that would be there once you turn it right side out. So just cut off some of that bulk there in the corners, and I'm just going to go around the whole thing doing that. Trim the turning hole tab down so that there's enough fabric there to stitch closed, but not so much that there's going to be a big bulge in your pad because it's like sitting over the core. I forgot to record the process of turning the pad right side out, but basically I just turn it out and then use a thick knitting needle to get all those pointy areas turned out completely and looking sharp. I did also press this with an iron to make sure it was flat. That makes it a little easier to sew. It's not completely necessary, but it makes it a little easier sometimes. Okay, so I'm just using a straight stitch to top stitch along the edge of the pad. As you can see, I'm lining up the edge of the pad to the edge of the foot, and with this foot I can really see what's going on, which is helpful. So when I get to these sharp turns, I lift the presser foot, pivot the pad, and try to keep the stitching even, like an even amount away from the edge of the pad. I'm sorry if I'm blanking on like the proper terms to use for all of this. So, yep, and then I just keep going, and I go pretty slow. This whole pad, I think, took me like 30 minutes to sew. There's a lot of details on this one, so that also takes more time, but I'm not a speed sewist. So I used to get pretty anxious about how slow I go, but over time you get faster. You figure out which areas you can not pay as much attention to, and then you also build muscle memory over time, so you get faster and quality improves as well. So I'm lifting, pivoting, just doing a whole bunch of straight lines to make those pretty curves. I also have to keep like rolling the edge of the pad between my fingers to make sure that it's even. Sometimes like the backing will want to roll towards the front, and that can be a little annoying to me. So I get really fussy about the details, but some of this might not bother you at all, and if that's the case, that is totally fine. If you're sewing pads for yourself and you're not fussy about details, then this will be much easier for you. So us perfectionists can be driven a little crazy by that. Okay, I think the stitch length that I'm using here is maybe 3 or slightly longer. With these fabrics that are piled, like Sherpa or OBV, bamboo velour, I like to use a longer stitch length because it just seems like the shorter ones are just chewing on the pad because it's so much to get through the machine. So 3 or bigger for top stitching this type of thick fabric seems best in my opinion. Yeah, I use the same color thread for everything. I'm kind of a minimalist when it comes to sewing, So I use like a medium gray. Okay, I lied. I have two. I have a light gray and a medium gray, and that's what I use for everything. Now, if I were sewing clothing, I don't think I'd be able to get away with that, but for pads, as long as it's pretty close, light or dark, then I can't even see the thread anyway. So, but I do think it's really pretty when I see displays on people's walls of all their different color threads. But I also get a little anxious about the cost of it, like matching threads and having a big collection of different colors. Okay, let's talk about the distance away from the edge that you want to sew. I've found that thinner pads, like if you're sewing with quilter's cotton on the top and a thin fleece on the back or pea-wool on the back, like that's going to be a really thin pad, then I would want to sew closer to the edge. But when it gets thicker, it gets very difficult to sew close to the edge and have it look nice. So stitch further away from the edge, the thicker your fabric is. And I think that looks nicer, easier to manage. I want to mention another reason that I use flannel as a hidden layer. I used to use muslin, that works as well. But a hidden layer that is woven and not stretchy helps to stabilize the stretchiness of the other fabrics. Makes it much easier to sew the sewing line and also top stitching. So when you're sewing something like bamboo velour or bamboo sherpa or a knit fabric that has stretch in it, it gets difficult to sew like the top stitching. The pad wants to stretch all over the place and the edges can look wavy. With practice, it's fine, but it's much easier, in my opinion, to sew stretchy fabrics that have been stabilized with a woven layer in the middle. So flannel or even just quilter's cotton or muslin. Muslin that is really thin is a great option if you don't want to add any bulk to the pad, because it's so thin that I can hardly tell it's in there. I'm adding the flannel in this because of the extra absorbency benefit, but it does make the pad just slightly more substantial, which is a pro or a con depending on what your goals are. After backstitching and snipping the threads, we are ready to add some snaps. So I use cam snaps. They are plastic. I use them in the bronze color because that seems to match just about anything, and it also matches the WinPro color that I happen to have. If I could do it all over again, I think I wish that I could get just a big pack of random color snaps. That would be fun. But anyway, fold over the wings and get them in the position that you like them, that you think you're gonna want to use the pad in. And then I poke the owl through the top wing, trying not to go through the whole pad, just that wing. And then I can see where it needs to go on the second one when I do that. So then I poke holes through both wings and then use my big snap press to attach the snaps. I used to use hand pliers. They work just fine, but when I was making lots of pads, that got kind of hard on the hands. So the big press is an option, but the hand one does just fine if you're just sewing pads for yourself at home. There are two different die parts, one for the male part and the female part. I'm not sure how to say that, but so you have to switch that out. So when I'm like batch sewing a bunch of pads, then I'll attach all of the innies to all the pads and then change the die part and then do all of the outies. So there it is. Once the snaps are on, I check to make sure that it snaps up just fine. A couple of times I have made pads and accidentally put like 2 outies on both wings, and then obviously that pad's not going to snap up. So it's good if you're selling pads to check to make sure they snap properly, because your brain can go on autopilot and make a really simple mistake like that. So thanks for watching this so far. If you've made it this far, I hope it's been helpful. Let me know what your questions are, because I have been doing this so long, I forget what I need to even say. You know, so much is just muscle memory at this point. And I hope that you get to that point too, where you enjoy it so much that it all just becomes integral in your knowledge and your muscle memory, and you can have a lot of fun with it, going to pick out new prints and even designing like modifications for your pads. You are very welcome to modify any of my patterns in a way that is fun for you, that meets your needs, and you can share the way that you modify them in the group, in like the sewing group. That's totally fine. I'm not bothered by that at all. Just don't like modify it and then like resell the pattern. That would be like, I don't like that. But anyway, my goal is that you enjoy the patterns and enjoy the hobby itself.